The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the city streets as Officer Ben Carter and Sergeant Roy Mitchell cruised through the neighborhood in their patrol car. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was tense, and not for the first time that day. Roy, a veteran officer with a gruff demeanor, had been venting his frustrations about the precinct's new captain, Anthony Harris. "I've been on this force for 20 years, Roy grumbled, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Now they bring in someone with zero understanding of how things actually work. He'll run this department into the ground with all his progressive ideas." Ben, sitting in the passenger seat, tried to focus on the passing streets, but couldn't ignore the unease rising within him. A rookie officer just a few months into the job, Ben was eager to make a difference but had quickly realized the complexities of working alongside someone like Roy. He shifted uncomfortably, debating whether to speak up. "Maybe we should give him a chance," Ben suggested cautiously. "Captain Harris seems committed to improving things for everyone." Roy scoffed loudly. "You're too green, kid. Guys like him don't understand what it takes to keep these streets clean. Trust me, they're all the same, always looking to turn everything upside down." Ben bit his lip, choosing silence over confrontation. The tension between his idealism and Roy's cynicism had been building for weeks. He wasn't sure how much longer he could endure it, but he knew that questioning Roy too openly could make his own position in the department precarious. As they turned onto a quieter street lined with small shops and cafes, Roy's attention was drawn to a sleek black sedan idling at a red light. The vehicle was spotless, its driver dressed sharply in a tailored suit. The man exuded confidence, but something about him clearly rubbed Roy the wrong way. "Look at that," Roy muttered, narrowing his eyes. "Bet he stole that car." Ben frowned, glancing at the man in question. The driver wasn't doing anything illegal. He was obeying all traffic laws, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. "He's just waiting for the light to change," Ben said, his voice uncertain. Roy sneered. "Don't be naive, Carter. You think guys like that belong in cars like those? Time for a little routine check." He flicked on the patrol car's flashing lights. The black sedan pulled over smoothly, its driver shifting slightly in his seat, but otherwise remaining composed. Ben's stomach churned as they came to a stop behind the car. Something about this didn't feel right, but he couldn't bring himself to object outright. Roy stepped out of the patrol car, his movements deliberate and authoritative. Ben followed reluctantly, his unease growing with every step. The driver rolled down his window as they approached, his expression calm but wary. "Is there a problem, officers?" the man asked, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of apprehension. Roy leaned in, his presence almost intrusive. "License and registration," he demanded curtly. The tone of his voice made it clear this wasn't a friendly interaction. The man nodded, complying without protest. As he handed over the requested documents, Ben noticed a slight tremor in his hands. The driver had every right to be nervous, Ben thought. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. "David Ellis," Roy read aloud, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "What brings you to this part of town, Mr. Ellis?" David met Roy's gaze evenly. "I'm on my way to a business meeting," he replied. "Is there a specific reason you pulled me over?" Roy ignored the question, stepping back to circle the vehicle like a predator sizing up its prey. "Nice car you've got here," he remarked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "How does someone like you afford something like this?" David took a deep breath, visibly trying to maintain his composure. "I work hard for my money, officer. Now, if I'm not being detained, I'd like to be on my way." Roy's face hardened. "Oh, we're not done here yet," he said, resting his hand on his holster. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "I do mind," David replied firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't consent to a search." Roy's expression darkened. "Got something to hide, do you?" Without waiting for a response, he yanked open the car door and began rummaging through the vehicle. Ben's heart sank. "Sir," he began hesitantly, "I don't think we have probable cause for this." Roy shot him a withering look. "Stay out of it, Carter. You're here to observe and learn." As Roy continued his search, Ben felt a sinking dread in his stomach. Then, out of the corner of his eye, He saw Roy discreetly pull a small bag of white powder from his pocket and slip it under the driver's seat. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. "Well, well, well," Roy announced triumphantly, holding up the bag as though it were a trophy. "What do we have here?" David's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's not mine," he protested. "You just planted that." Roy smirked, ignoring the accusation. "Looks like we've got ourselves a drug dealer. Step out of the car. You're under arrest." Ben stood frozen, his mind racing. He knew what was happening was wrong, illegal even, but the weight of the moment paralyzed him. If he spoke out, he risked his career and his reputation. But if he stayed silent, he would be complicit in ruining an innocent man's life. David turned to Ben, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. "Officer, you saw what happened. Tell him this isn't right." Ben avoided David's gaze, the internal conflict tearing him apart. His father's words echoed in his mind. "A good officer doesn't just enforce the law. A good officer protects the innocent and upholds justice no matter the cost." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Roy moved to handcuff David, his demeanor confident and smug. "Don't bother resisting," he sneered. "You're not getting out of this one." In that moment, Ben made his decision. His hand trembled as he stepped forward, positioning himself between Roy and David. "Stop," Ben said, his voice shaking but resolute. "This isn't right." Roy froze, glaring at Ben in disbelief. "What did you say, rookie?" Ben swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I said stop. You planted that evidence, and we both know it." Roy's face turned red with rage. "You're making a big mistake, Carter. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "Yes," Ben replied, standing his ground. "I'm doing the right thing." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. David watched the scene unfold, hope flickering in his eyes. Roy glared at Ben, his chest heaving with anger. The standoff felt like it lasted an eternity. Finally, Roy stepped back, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. "You're going to regret this," he snarled. Ben ignored him, turning to David. "I'm sorry for what's happened here, sir. Let's sort this out properly." As Ben reached for his radio to call for backup, he knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross. But for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he was living up to the oath he had taken. This was the moment that would define his career and perhaps change everything. The tension in the air was electric. Roy's hand hovered near his holster, his face twisted in anger and disbelief as Ben stepped forward to defy him. David Ellis, still calm despite the escalating situation, stood resolutely beside his car. For a moment, the standoff between the three men felt like the entire world had ground to a halt, all eyes focused on the unfolding drama. Then, breaking the silence, David spoke. His voice was calm but carried a weight that commanded attention. "Officers, I think it's time I introduced myself properly," he said, his steady gaze shifting between Roy and Ben. He reached into his inner pocket slowly, mindful of the tension in Roy's stance. "I'm Captain David Harris, the newly appointed head of this precinct." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Roy froze, his bravado faltering as the reality of what he had just heard sank in. Ben's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he couldn't process the revelation. David calmly retrieved his badge and identification, holding them out for the two officers to see. Roy's face drained of color. That can't be right," he stammered, his confidence quickly unraveling. "You're lying." David raised an eyebrow, his expression firm but composed. "I assure you, Sergeant Mitchell, I'm not lying. I was on my way to meet with the commissioner when you pulled me over." Ben hesitantly stepped closer, taking the badge from David's outstretched hand. It was real. Every detail checked out. He handed it back with trembling hands, the full weight of the situation settling onto his shoulders. He had just witnessed his partner try to frame their new captain. Ben started, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? Roy, on the other hand, quickly switched to defensive mode. "Listen, Captain, this is all a misunderstanding," he began, his tone shifting to one of forced politeness. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I was just doing my duty to investigate. David's calm demeanor didn't waver. Your duty? He echoed, his tone icy. Your duty involves racially profiling an innocent man, conducting an illegal search, and planting evidence to justify your actions. Roy's face turned red with anger, though his bluster had noticeably diminished. I don't know what you think you saw, but I was just doing my job. These streets are dangerous, Captain. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to keep them safe. David's eyes narrowed. No, Sergeant. That's not how this works. The law doesn't bend for anyone, least of all for those of us sworn to uphold it. Ben, standing awkwardly to the side, felt a surge of guilt. His hesitation had allowed things to escalate to this point. Clearing his throat, he finally spoke up, his voice unsteady. Captain Harris, I saw everything. I saw Sergeant Mitchell plant that bag in your car. I should have stopped it sooner, and I'm sorry. David turned to Ben, his expression softening slightly. It takes courage to admit that, Officer Carter, he said, and courage is what's needed right now. He gestured toward Ben's radio. Call for backup. We need to document everything and ensure this situation is handled properly. Roy's anger boiled over. Backup? Are you serious? This is insane. You can't treat me like a criminal. I'm your partner, Carter. Ben hesitated, Roy's words hitting him like a gut punch. He had looked up to Roy as a seasoned veteran, someone to guide him through the challenges of being an officer. But now, that image was shattered. Summoning every ounce of resolve, Ben reached for his radio. Dispatch, he said, his voice trembling but firm. We need backup at my location. This is Officer Carter. Priority situation involving suspected misconduct. Roy let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. You're making a huge mistake, rookie. You think Harris is going to protect you? You're throwing away your career for this. Ben met Roy's glare with newfound determination. I took an oath to uphold justice, not to cover for someone abusing their power. David stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Roy and Ben. Sergeant Mitchell, your actions today have violated not only department policy but the law. I suggest you stand down now, or this will get much worse for you. For a moment, it seemed Roy might resist. His hand twitched near his belt and his jaw clenched as he stared down David. But the sight of the captain's badge, coupled with the arrival of backup units now pulling up to the scene, made resistance futile. Slowly, Roy raised his hands, stepping away from David and Ben. Fine, he muttered, his voice filled with venom. You want to ruin my career? Go ahead. But don't think for a second this is over. The sound of car doors opening and officers stepping out filled the air as reinforcements arrived. Sergeant Roy Mitchell, once so confident and untouchable, now stood surrounded by his peers, his bravado reduced to hollow defiance. David turned to the arriving officers. Secure the scene, he instructed. Take Sergeant Mitchell into custody and document everything. There will be a full investigation into his actions. The officers hesitated briefly, exchanging glances, but the authority in David's tone left no room for doubt. They approached Roy, cuffing him as he glared at David and Ben. This is a mistake, Roy snarled as he was led to a patrol car. You'll regret this. David ignored him, his focus shifting to Ben. Officer Carter, he said, his tone softer now. I understand the position you were in today. It's not easy to stand up to someone like Mitchell, but you did the right thing. Ben nodded, though the weight of the day's events was clearly visible on his face. Thank you, Captain, he said quietly. I wish I had acted sooner. David placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. You acted when it mattered most. That's what counts. As Roy was driven away, the street slowly began to return to normal. Onlookers who had gathered during the commotion dispersed, though many had recorded the events on their phones. The truth of what had happened would soon spread, sparking conversations and perhaps controversy. David stood for a moment looking at the patrol car as it disappeared around the corner. His expression was unreadable, a mix of resolve and weariness. Let's head back to the station, he finally said to Ben. We have a lot of work ahead of us." As they climbed into the patrol car, Ben couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, despite the gravity of what had just transpired. The truth had come to light, and the first steps toward justice had been taken. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The fallout from Roy's actions, and the corruption it symbolized, would ripple through the precinct, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. And Ben was determined to be on the right side of that change. The atmosphere at the precinct was electric. Word of Sergeant Roy Mitchell's arrest spread like wildfire, leaving officers in varying states of disbelief, anger, and silent introspection. Captain Harris had returned to headquarters after the explosive traffic stop, bringing with him not just evidence of Roy's misconduct but a mandate for change. The next morning, Captain Harris convened an emergency meeting in the precinct's briefing room. The space was packed, every officer keenly aware that the events of the previous day had set a precedent no one could ignore. Harris stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding and unyielding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harris began, his voice steady and authoritative. "What happened yesterday is a wake-up call for all of us. Sergeant Mitchell's actions were not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a deeper issue within this department. It's my responsibility to address it, and I intend to." The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffling of feet. Harris's eyes swept over the crowd, gauging their reactions. Effective immediately, Sergeant Mitchell is suspended without pay pending a formal investigation. We will also be reviewing all past complaints of misconduct, including those that may have been ignored or swept under the rug. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. The implications were clear. No one would be immune to scrutiny. "This isn't just about one officer," Harris continued. "This is about restoring trust, among ourselves and with the community we serve. If you've done your job with integrity, you have nothing to worry about. But if you haven't, consider this your warning." As the meeting concluded, murmurs filled the room. The announcement had struck a nerve, and everyone knew the weeks ahead would be turbulent. Outside the precinct, the community's response was a mixture of relief, anger, and guarded optimism. Local media seized on the story, framing it as both a long-overdue reckoning and a flashpoint for systemic reform. Town halls and community forums were organized, with residents voicing their concerns and frustrations. "I'm glad they're finally doing something about this," said one local activist during a heated discussion at a community center. "But why did it take so long? How many people suffered while this kind of behavior was allowed to continue?" Others expressed hope. "Captain Harris seems like the real deal," one resident commented. "Maybe this is the start of something better." Protests and rallies were organized, some calling for more drastic action, while others sought to support Harris's efforts. Signs reading, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now," became common sights around the precinct. For Officer Ben Carter, the aftermath of the incident was a whirlwind of emotions. He spent sleepless nights replaying the traffic stop in his mind, haunted by the knowledge that he had hesitated to act. His guilt weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had let both David and the community down. One afternoon, as Ben sat in the break room nursing a cup of coffee, Captain Harris approached him. "Mind if I sit?" Harris asked, gesturing to the chair across from Ben. Ben nodded, his throat dry. "Of course, Captain." Harris studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've been quiet these past few days. I imagine you've got a lot on your mind." Ben nodded again, looking down at his coffee. "I should have spoken up sooner," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I had, maybe things wouldn't have gotten so bad." Harris leaned forward, his tone measured. "Ben, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Yes, you could have acted sooner. But the fact is you did act. When it mattered most, you chose to do the right thing. That takes courage, especially in a situation like the one you were in." Ben glanced up, surprised. "It doesn't feel like enough," he said. "It's a start," Harris replied firmly. "What matters now is what you do moving forward. Use this as a lesson. Speak up when you see something wrong, even if it's uncomfortable. That's how change happens." Ben nodded, Harris's words resonating deeply. He resolved to be better, to live up to the ideals that had inspired him to join the force in the first place. The events surrounding Roy's arrest and the subsequent investigation sent shockwaves through the city. Local media ran constant coverage, highlighting stories of people who had experienced similar injustices. Victims of past misconduct began coming forward, emboldened by the promise of accountability. At a town hall meeting held at a local school gymnasium, Captain Harris addressed a packed crowd. His speech was direct and heartfelt. "I understand the anger and frustration many of you feel," he said. "I feel it too. What happened under my watch is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring it never happens again. But I can't do this alone. Reform isn't just about policies. It's about culture. It's about every officer in this precinct committing to doing better." The room erupted in applause, though some faces remained skeptical. As Harris took questions from the audience, it became clear that rebuilding trust would be a long and difficult process. One attendee, an older woman named Mrs. Green, stood up and shared her story. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, she said. "I've seen the good and the bad from this department. I want to believe in change, but it's hard when we've been let down so many times." Harris nodded, his expression somber. "I hear you, Mrs. Green, and I promise you I'm committed to making this right. Hold us accountable, demand better from us, and know that we are working to earn back your trust." As the weeks passed, the investigation into Roy's misconduct uncovered a troubling pattern of behavior. Complaints that had been dismissed as unsubstantiated were re-examined, revealing a culture of complacency that had allowed abuse to flourish. Several other officers were placed under review, and new policies were implemented to increase transparency and accountability. Ben threw himself into the work, volunteering for community outreach programs and helping to implement Captain Harris's reforms. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was determined to make a difference. One evening, as Ben walked through the precinct, he noticed a bulletin board displaying thank you letters from community members. One letter, written by a young boy, caught his eye. "Thank you for helping make our neighborhood safer. My mom says not all police are bad, and I think she's right. Please keep doing what's right." Ben smiled, the words reinforcing his resolve. The path to change was difficult, but it was worth it. Stripped of his badge and uniform, Roy Mitchell sat alone in his small living room, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on him. The room felt stifling, a stark contrast to the authority and confidence he once carried. The walls, adorned with commendations from his decades of service, seemed to mock him now. Each plaque and photograph whispered of a career that had unraveled in a single day. The world outside had not been kind. News of his misconduct had spread far and wide, making him a pariah in the very community he had once patrolled. Strangers glared at him in public, and some neighbors refused to acknowledge him. Even his family struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the officer who had been publicly disgraced. Despite this, it was Roy's wife, Linda, who became his anchor. She had always been his fiercest critic and staunchest supporter. Sitting across from him one evening, her voice was firm but compassionate. "You made mistakes, Roy. Big ones," she said. "But you can't just sit here feeling sorry for yourself. You've got to face what you've done and try to make it right." Roy looked at her, his eyes hollow. "I don't know where to start. I've ruined everything." Linda leaned forward, placing a hand on his. "Start by owning up to it. Go to Captain Harris. Apologize. And then do something good for once. Something that doesn't involve wearing a badge." Taking Linda's advice, Roy worked up the courage to approach Captain Harris. The thought of facing the man he had wronged filled him with dread, but he knew it was a necessary step. Harris was in his office when Roy arrived at the precinct. The tension in the air was palpable as Roy stepped through the door, his posture stiff and his face etched with humility. Harris looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Captain," Roy began, his voice faltering, "I came to apologize." Harris leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. "Go on." Roy took a deep breath. "I've had time to think about what I did, what I've done over the years. I see now how much harm I caused, Not just to you, but to the community I was supposed to serve. I let my prejudices and ego cloud my judgment. I'm sorry." For a long moment, Harris said nothing. Roy shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, unsure if his words had made any impact. Finally, Harris spoke. "Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. Actions, Mitchell. Words are easy, but actions take effort. Are you willing to put in the effort?" Roy nodded earnestly. "Yes, I am. Tell me what I can do." Harris's tone was firm, but not unkind. "You need to earn back the trust you've lost, and that won't happen overnight. I want you to get involved in the community you let down. Volunteer, listen, and learn. There's a youth program at the community center on 3rd Street. They could use someone with your experience, if you're serious about making amends." Roy swallowed hard. The idea of walking into a space where he'd likely be met with skepticism, if not outright hostility, was daunting. But he nodded. "I'll do it." "Good," Harris said, his voice softening slightly. "Remember, this isn't about you. It's about them. Go with an open mind, and leave your ego at the door." The following week, Roy walked into the bustling community center with a mix of trepidation and determination. The youth program was in full swing, with kids of all ages running around, working on art projects, and playing basketball in the gym. A young coordinator named Maya greeted him with a wary glance. "You're Roy Mitchell?" she asked, her tone cautious. Roy nodded. "That's me. I'm here to help if you'll have me." Maya's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "We could use an extra pair of hands. Let's see what you can do." At first, Roy felt out of place. The kids eyed him suspiciously, and some parents whispered when they saw him. But he threw himself into the work, helping with everything from setting up activities to tutoring struggling students. He listened more than he spoke, letting his actions slowly start to bridge the gap between himself and the community. One day, while supervising a group of kids working on a mural, a boy named Jamal approached him. "You're that cop, right? The one who got in trouble?" Roy paused, unsure how to respond. Finally, he said, "Yeah, that's me. I messed up, Jamal, but I'm trying to do better." Jamal studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said simply, then handed Roy a paintbrush. "You can help with the sky." It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental to Roy. Slowly, the walls of distrust began to crack. As weeks turned into months, Roy became a regular fixture at the community center. He organized a mentorship program for at-risk youth, drawing on his years of experience as a police officer to teach conflict resolution and self-defense. He even helped secure funding for new equipment, using his connections to bring in resources the center sorely needed. The turning point came during a basketball game one evening. Roy, now more comfortable in his role, had joined a game with some of the older kids. As the game ended, one of the players, a high school senior named Marcus, approached him. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus said, hesitating. "I used to think all cops were bad. What you did before, it was wrong. But seeing you here now, it makes me think people can change." Roy felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot." By the end of his first year at the center, Roy had not only earned the respect of many in the community, but also found a renewed sense of purpose. Though he could never undo the harm he had caused, he was determined to spend the rest of his life making amends. One afternoon, as Roy was leaving the center, he ran into Captain Harris. Harris had come to check on the program's progress and was impressed by what he saw. "You've done good work here, Mitchell," Harris said. "I didn't think you had it in you." Roy smiled, a mix of humility and gratitude in his expression. "Thank you, Captain. I owe it to you, and to this community, for giving me a second chance." Harris nodded. "Keep it up. Redemption isn't a destination, it's a journey." As Roy watched Harris walk away, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he believed he could truly be part of the solution, not the problem. His journey was far from over, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. Captain David Harris sat at the head of the long conference table in the precinct's meeting room, his face resolute as he addressed the gathered officers. The room was filled with varying expressions: curiosity, skepticism, and cautious optimism. "We've all seen the consequences of failing to adapt," Harris began, his voice firm yet calm. "It's not enough to apologize for past mistakes. It's time to rebuild this department from the ground up, to ensure that every officer here upholds the values of integrity, fairness, and respect." Harris outlined a series of sweeping changes that would form the foundation of the department's transformation. Key among them were mandatory bias training, the implementation of body cameras for all officers, and the establishment of robust community outreach programs. "We will begin by acknowledging the biases we all carry," Harris continued. "The bias training is not about pointing fingers, but about becoming aware of our assumptions and learning how to act fairly and justly." Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, but Harris's commanding presence left no room for dissent. "We will also use body cameras to ensure transparency and accountability, for us and for the community we serve. These cameras are not a punishment. They're a tool to protect both our officers and our citizens." The announcement was met with murmurs, but Harris pressed on. "And finally, we will engage directly with the people in this community. Town halls, open forums, school visits, whatever it takes to rebuild trust. This department will not be a symbol of fear. It will be a beacon of hope." In the weeks following Harris's announcement, the precinct buzzed with activity. Training sessions were scheduled, body cameras distributed, and plans for community events drafted. Officers like Ben, emboldened by Harris's leadership, emerged as advocates for change. During one of the first bias training sessions, Ben shared his own journey with the group. "I didn't speak up when I should have," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "But I've learned that silence makes you complicit. We can't ignore the problems in front of us. We have to be part of the solution." His words resonated with many of his colleagues, sparking honest conversations about the challenges they faced and the changes needed within the force. Ben's willingness to be vulnerable and own up to his mistakes inspired others to take the training seriously. One of the senior officers, Detective Alvarez, approached Ben after a session. "You've got guts, kid," Alvarez said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's not easy admitting when you're wrong, but you've got my respect and my support." Encouraged by the positive response, Ben began organizing informal discussions among the officers, creating a safe space for them to share their concerns and ideas. Slowly but surely, a cultural shift began to take root within the precinct. Harris knew that internal reform was only half the battle. To truly repair the fractured relationship between the police and the community, he needed to foster open dialogue and mutual respect. With this goal in mind, the department partnered with local organizations to host a series of town halls and community events. The first town hall was held in a local high school auditorium, packed with residents eager to voice their concerns. Harris stood at the front of the room, flanked by Ben and other officers who had shown a commitment to the new direction. A woman in the audience stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "My son was stopped 3 times last year just for walking home from school," she said. "He's a good kid, but he's scared of the police now. How do you plan to change that?" Harris nodded, acknowledging her pain. "I can't undo what happened to your son, ma'am, but I can promise you this. We're committed to doing better. Our officers are undergoing training to address these biases, and we're implementing strict accountability measures. But change takes time, and we need your partnership to make it happen." Ben stepped forward, adding, "We're not here to defend the mistakes of the past. We're here to listen and to learn. Please hold us accountable, and don't stop sharing your stories. They're what will drive this change." The town hall ended with cautious optimism, the residents appreciating the transparency and commitment displayed by the officers. It was a small but significant step toward rebuilding trust. In addition to town halls, the department organized community events like youth mentorship programs, neighborhood cleanups, and even basketball games between officers and local teens. These events provided opportunities for residents to interact with officers outside the context of law enforcement, fostering relationships based on understanding and respect. At one such event, Ben found himself coaching a group of kids during a basketball game. A young boy named Caleb, initially wary of the officers, gradually warmed up to Ben as they joked and strategized on the court. After the game, Caleb approached Ben. "You're not like the other cops," he said quietly. "You actually listen." Ben crouched down to meet Caleb's eyes. "That's what I'm here for, Caleb, to listen and to help. And if I ever mess up, you've got to call me out, okay?" Caleb nodded, a small smile breaking through his initial reserve. It was moments like these that reminded Ben why the reforms were worth fighting for. As the precinct continued to evolve under Harris's leadership, the community began to see tangible results. Complaints of misconduct decreased, and more residents attended the town halls and events. Slowly but surely, trust was being rebuilt. However, the journey was far from over. Harris and his team knew that systemic change required persistence and vigilance. They remained committed to holding themselves accountable and maintaining open lines of communication with the community. One evening, as Harris reviewed the precinct's progress, Ben walked into his office. "Captain," Ben began, "I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance to do better, for leading us." Harris looked up, his expression softening. "You earned that chance, Ben, and you're proving every day that change is possible. Keep it up." As Ben left the office, Harris leaned back in his chair, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The work ahead was daunting, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Together, with determination, humility, and the support of the community, they were building something better. The precinct was no longer just a symbol of authority. It was becoming a place of accountability, compassion, and service. And though the road to reform was long, every step forward was a victory worth celebrating. Roy Mitchell stood at the edge of the city park, a place that had become a regular part of his new routine. The man who once carried a badge with a sense of invulnerability now carried a humble sense of duty. His days were spent volunteering with a local youth program, mentoring kids, and organizing community events. It was a far cry from his days as a patrol officer, but Roy found unexpected fulfillment in this new chapter of his life. Yet, redemption is rarely a smooth path. One afternoon, as Roy was helping a group of teens prepare for a basketball tournament, the air was charged with tension. Across the street, a protest was forming. A large group of community members had gathered in response to a recent incident involving police use of force in another city. Emotions were running high, and the signs and chants reflected years of frustration and pain. As the crowd grew larger, Roy's phone buzzed with an alert. Community leaders were urging residents to remain peaceful, but the undercurrent of anger was palpable. From his position in the park, Roy could see a small group of agitators moving toward the protest, their body language tense, their intentions unclear. Roy felt the weight of his past mistakes press down on him. He had once been part of the problem, but now he faced a moment of truth. Would he step up and use his hard-earned lessons to make a difference, or would he let his past define him? Roy took a deep breath and approached the protest. Many in the crowd recognized him, and their faces ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. He heard someone mutter, "What's he doing here? He's part of the reason we're out here." Ignoring the murmurs, Roy stepped onto a nearby bench and raised his hands. "Everyone, listen up," he called out, his voice carrying over the noise. "I know I don't deserve your trust yet, but I'm asking for your attention." The crowd quieted slightly, some turning to face him while others continued to chant. Roy's hands trembled, but he pressed on. "I've made mistakes, big ones. I've abused the power I was given, and I've hurt people who didn't deserve it. I lost my badge because of it, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life." His voice grew steadier. "But I've learned that regret isn't enough. It's what you do after that matters. I'm here today not as a former officer, but as a member of this community, and I'm asking all of you to show the strength and dignity I didn't have when I wore that badge. Don't let anger control this moment. Let's make it about justice, not destruction." The crowd murmured, some nodding while others remained unconvinced. Suddenly, a loud voice shouted, "And why should we listen to you?" A man stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. You're just a washed-up cop trying to make yourself feel better." Roy nodded, acknowledging the man's anger. "You're right," he said. "I don't deserve your trust. But this isn't about me. It's about what happens next. Violence won't bring justice. It'll just give them another excuse to ignore us. Let's be better." At that moment, the group of agitators Roy had noticed earlier began moving into the crowd, shouting inflammatory remarks and trying to incite chaos. Roy acted quickly, stepping down from the bench and positioning himself between the agitators and the protesters. "Hey!" he shouted, addressing the agitators. "This isn't your fight. If you're here to start trouble, leave now." One of the agitators laughed. "What are you gonna do, tough guy? You're not a cop anymore." Roy held his ground. "No, I'm not. But I care about this community and I'm not going to let you turn this into a riot." The tension was thick as the agitators sized him up. The crowd watched anxiously, waiting to see what would happen. Just as it seemed the situation might spiral out of control, a group of community leaders arrived, including Captain Harris. Harris stepped forward, his presence commanding respect. "This protest is about justice, not destruction," he said firmly. "We won't let anyone hijack it for their own agenda." With Harris's support and Roy's visible commitment to peace, the agitators eventually backed down, leaving the protest. The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants shifting from anger to unity. Justice, peace, justice, peace. Roy stepped back, breathing a sigh of relief. Harris approached him, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that well," he said. "I've seen seasoned officers struggle to de-escalate situations like this." Roy shrugged, his voice quiet. "I'm just trying to do better, Captain. That's all I can do." Harris nodded. "And you're succeeding. Keep it up." Meanwhile, across town, Ben was facing his own test. As one of the most vocal advocates for the department's reforms, he had been asked to mentor a group of new recruits. Standing in the training room, Ben looked out at the fresh faces eager to serve, but also nervous about the challenges ahead. "Being a police officer is about more than enforcing laws," Ben began, his tone serious but encouraging. "It's about being a protector, a mediator, and a servant to the community. And it's about making tough calls, even when they're unpopular." One of the recruits raised a hand. "Officer Carter, what do you do when you see a fellow officer doing something wrong?" Ben paused, his mind flashing back to the moment Roy planted evidence in David Ellis's car. "You speak up," he said firmly, "because if you don't, you're complicit. It's not easy. It can cost you friendships, even your career. But integrity has to come first." The recruits nodded, their expressions a mix of admiration and determination. Ben continued, sharing lessons he had learned from Captain Harris and his own journey toward understanding justice. As the session ended, one of the recruits approached Ben. "Officer Carter, I just want to say thank you. Hearing your story makes me want to do better." Ben smiled. "That's the goal. Now go out there and prove it." That evening, Ben and Roy both reflected on their journeys. For Roy, stepping up during the protest had been a turning point, a chance to prove that change was possible, even for someone with his past. For Ben, mentoring the next generation of officers reaffirmed his belief in the power of leadership and accountability. Their paths were different, but intertwined, each man striving to leave a better legacy than the one they had inherited. Under Captain Harris's guidance, the department was transforming into a force for good, one small victory at a time. And as the city began to heal, the community and the officers who served it moved forward together, united by a shared vision of justice and integrity. Under Captain David Harris's leadership, the precinct became a model of reform and accountability, catching the attention of neighboring jurisdictions. Harris frequently traveled to other precincts, sharing the blueprint for his changes: mandatory bias training, body cameras, community outreach programs, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. "I'm not here to dictate," Harris would tell precinct commanders. "I'm here to show what's possible when trust becomes your department's foundation." The ripple effect was undeniable. Departments once resistant to change began to implement similar policies, inspired by the success of Harris's reforms. the city saw a decline in complaints of police misconduct and a measurable increase in community trust. Officers reported feeling more engaged with their work, finding pride in being part of the solution. Statewide, Harris was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences, where his honesty about the challenges and rewards of reform resonated deeply. What began as a single precinct's transformation was now becoming a movement. Ben Carter, once a hesitant rookie unsure of his own place on the force, emerged as a rising star in this new era. His ability to connect with the community and his peers earned him widespread respect. Harris, seeing Ben's potential, assigned him to lead a new program aimed at fostering relationships between officers and underprivileged neighborhoods. Ben's program, Bridge Builders, paired officers with community mentors to work on joint projects like school safety initiatives and youth leadership workshops. The program not only brought officers closer to the people they served, but also helped young residents see police as partners rather than adversaries. At the precinct, Ben's reputation for fairness and integrity made him a trusted figure. Recruits sought his advice, and even seasoned officers found themselves learning from his example. "You've come a long way, Carter," Harris said one day after a successful community event. "Keep this up, and you'll have my job one day." Ben smiled but shook his head. "I'm just trying to make a difference, Captain, like you showed me." Meanwhile, Roy Mitchell, once an emblem of the department's failures, had become a symbol of redemption. His work in the community gained traction as he collaborated with local organizations to create opportunities for at-risk youth. Roy spearheaded initiatives like job training programs and after-school sports leagues, ensuring young people had positive outlets and paths to success. Harris, recognizing the value of Roy's unique perspective, often invited him to speak at precinct meetings and town halls. "Nobody knows the damage bias can do better than someone who's lived it," Harris told him. "Your voice matters here." One of Roy's proudest moments came when he co-hosted a workshop with Ben at the police academy, sharing his story with recruits. "I'm not proud of who I was," Roy admitted to the room, "but I'm proud of the changes I've made, and I'm here to make sure none of you ever go down the road I did." His candor struck a chord, and by the end of the session, recruits lined up to thank him for his honesty. It was clear that Roy's impact extended far beyond his past mistakes. The trio of Harris, Ben, and Roy worked tirelessly to ensure that the precinct's transformation would endure. Together, they developed a mentorship program, pairing experienced officers with new recruits to instill a culture of accountability and respect. They also established a community advisory board to keep the lines of communication open between law enforcement and residents. The precinct became a beacon of hope, not just for the city, but for the broader law enforcement community. Harris's vision, Ben's dedication, and Roy's redemption proved that change was possible when leaders were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and build a foundation of trust. As Harris prepared to meet with a state task force on police reform, he gathered Ben and Roy in his office. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The work we've done here is proof of what's possible, but the real test is making sure the next generation picks up where we leave off." Ben nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "We're ready, Captain." Roy, now a confident and respected advocate, added, "And so is the community." Together, they left the office, ready to face the challenges ahead. Their story reminds us all that kindness, integrity, and courage can create ripples of change that go far beyond what we imagine. Together, they had proven that transformation is possible, one act, one choice, and one person at a time. If this story has inspired you, join us in spreading its message. Hit the subscribe button to support our channel and be part of a community that believes in the power of positive change.